Question 1. Compliance review shows that Arcadis is in the process of hiring new consultants for a critical infrastructure project. Which of the following risk assessment approaches best aligns with UK regulatory frameworks and SISI guidelines for evaluating potential candidates? Option A. Relying primarily on the candidate's curriculum vitae and interview performance to gauge their suitability and risk profile. Option B. Implementing a multi-stage risk assessment process that includes thorough background checks, reference verification, and an evaluation of the candidate's understanding of relevant professional ethics and compliance requirements, tailored to the specific project risks. Option C. Adopting a risk assessment framework commonly used in a different jurisdiction without verifying its applicability to UK regulations and SISI guidelines. Option D. Conducting a brief, standardized risk assessment that focuses only on immediate, obvious risks without in-depth verification. The correct answer is B. Implementing a multi-stage risk assessment process that includes thorough background checks, reference verification, and an evaluation of the candidate's understanding of relevant professional ethics and compliance requirements, tailored to the specific project risks. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because Arcadis, as a global engineering and consultancy firm, operates within diverse regulatory landscapes. Identifying and applying the correct risk assessment framework requires a nuanced understanding of the specific legal and ethical obligations applicable to its operations in the relevant jurisdiction. The challenge lies in ensuring that the chosen approach not only aligns with general best practices, but also strictly adheres to the particular requirements of the Arcadis hiring assessment test's specified jurisdiction, which is assumed to be UK regulation and SISI guidelines for this context. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that systematically identifies, analyzes, and evaluates potential risks associated with new hires. This includes considering factors such as the candidate's background, the role's responsibilities, and the potential impact of any identified risks on Arcadis' reputation, financial stability, and compliance obligations. This approach is ethically sound and legally compliant because it prioritizes due diligence, a core principle in recruitment and employment law. Specifically, under UK regulations and SISI guidelines, employers have a duty of care to ensure they are not employing individuals who pose a significant risk, and this extends to conducting appropriate background checks and risk assessments. This proactive stance helps prevent potential breaches of professional conduct, regulatory non-compliance, and reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on a candidate's self-reported information without independent verification. This fails to meet the due diligence requirements mandated by UK employment law and professional conduct standards. It exposes Arcadis to significant risks, including hiring individuals with undisclosed conflicts of interest or a history of misconduct, which could lead to regulatory sanctions and reputational harm. Another incorrect approach is to conduct a superficial risk assessment that only considers obvious risks, ignoring subtle indicators or potential future issues. This demonstrates a lack of professional rigor and a failure to adequately discharge the employer's responsibilities, potentially contravening the spirit of regulatory oversight aimed at maintaining professional standards within the industry. A third incorrect approach would be to adopt a risk assessment framework from a different jurisdiction without ensuring its suitability and compliance with UK regulations. This could lead to overlooking critical risk factors or implementing measures that are not legally permissible or ethically appropriate in the UK context, thereby failing to protect Arcadis and its stakeholders. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the scope and objectives of the risk assessment, considering the specific role and its associated risks. This should be followed by identifying relevant regulatory requirements and ethical guidelines applicable to the jurisdiction. The next step involves selecting and implementing appropriate risk assessment methodologies, ensuring they are robust and comprehensive. Finally, continuous monitoring and review of the assessment process and its outcomes are crucial to adapt to evolving risks and regulatory landscapes. Question 2. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood and high impact rating for potential unauthorized access to sensitive project data within Arcadis' current data management system. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible approach to address this identified risk? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify specific vulnerabilities and implement targeted security controls, such as enhanced access management and data encryption, before any significant changes to data handling procedures are made. Option B. Immediately deploy a new, advanced data sharing platform, assuming it will inherently improve security and address the identified risks. Option C. Proceed with current data handling practices, as the client has not specifically raised concerns about data security for this project. Option D. Delegate the entire responsibility for mitigating this risk solely to the IT department, trusting their expertise to handle it independently. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify specific vulnerabilities and implement targeted security controls, such as enhanced access management and data encryption, before any significant changes to data handling procedures are made. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Arcadis, as a consulting firm, is entrusted with sensitive client data and project information. The risk of a data breach, whether accidental or malicious, carries significant reputational damage, financial penalties, and potential legal liabilities. The challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient data sharing and collaboration with robust security measures, ensuring that all actions align with regulatory requirements and ethical obligations to clients. Careful judgment is required to identify and mitigate risks effectively, without unduly hindering operational efficiency. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a proactive and systematic risk assessment process, specifically focusing on identifying potential vulnerabilities in data handling procedures and implementing appropriate controls. This aligns with the principles of data protection and risk management expected of professional services firms. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing data privacy and professional conduct, mandate that organizations take reasonable steps to protect sensitive information. By conducting a thorough risk assessment, Arcadis can identify specific threats, evaluate their likelihood and impact, and then implement targeted mitigation strategies, such as enhanced access controls, encryption, and employee training. This approach demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to safeguarding client interests and complying with legal obligations. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing a new data sharing platform without a prior risk assessment is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses a critical step in ensuring data security and compliance. This approach fails to identify potential vulnerabilities that the new platform might introduce or exacerbate, leaving Arcadis exposed to data breaches and regulatory noncompliance. It prioritizes expediency over security and due diligence. Relying solely on the IT department to manage all data security risks is also professionally unsound. While the IT department plays a crucial role, data security is a shared responsibility that extends to all employees and management. This approach creates a single point of failure and neglects the need for a holistic risk management strategy that involves all relevant stakeholders and considers operational and business risks alongside technical ones. Ignoring potential risks because the client has not explicitly requested specific security measures is ethically and legally deficient. Professional service providers have an inherent duty of care to their clients, which includes proactively identifying and mitigating risks associated with the services provided, regardless of explicit client requests. This approach demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and could lead to significant harm to the client and Arcadis. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Arcadis should adopt a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves 1. Identifying potential risks associated with any proposed action or system change. 2. Assessing the likelihood and impact of each identified risk. 3. Evaluating existing controls and determining if they are adequate. 4. Developing and implementing appropriate mitigation strategies for unacceptable risks. 5. Regularly reviewing and monitoring risks and controls. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and protect the interests of the firm and its clients. Question 3. Quality control measures reveal that a recent Arcadis project for a major industrial client may have inadvertently led to a breach of local environmental discharge regulations. The project involved the design and implementation of a new wastewater treatment system. The internal review highlights potential inconsistencies in the system's operational data compared to the permitted discharge limits. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the Arcadis project manager? Option A. Assume the data is erroneous and proceed with the project closeout, as internal quality control measures are generally reliable. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive internal investigation to fully understand the nature and extent of the potential noncompliance, document all findings, and develop a remediation plan before engaging with the client or regulatory bodies. Option C. Immediately inform the client of the potential noncompliance and advise them to cease operations of the new system until further notice, without conducting a detailed internal review. Option D. Directly report the potential noncompliance to the relevant environmental regulatory authority, providing all available data, and await their instructions. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive internal investigation to fully understand the nature and extent of the potential noncompliance, document all findings, and develop a remediation plan before engaging with the client or regulatory bodies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Arcadis, as a consulting firm, has a duty of care to its clients and to uphold professional standards. The discovery of potential noncompliance with environmental regulations requires immediate and careful judgment to mitigate risks, protect the client's interests, and maintain Arcadis' reputation. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for thorough investigation with the urgency of addressing potential regulatory breaches. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of risk assessment and mitigation. This entails gathering all relevant information, identifying the specific nature and extent of the potential noncompliance, and then developing a clear plan to rectify the situation. This aligns with professional ethical codes that mandate integrity, competence, and due diligence. Specifically, it reflects a commitment to identifying and managing risks, which is a fundamental aspect of responsible consulting practice. Regulatory frameworks often require firms to have robust internal controls and to act with reasonable skill and care to avoid causing harm or breaching legal obligations. An incorrect approach that involves ignoring the findings or downplaying their significance would be professionally unacceptable. This failure would violate the duty of care owed to the client and could expose both the client and Arcadis to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and financial liabilities. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for regulatory compliance. Another incorrect approach, such as immediately reporting the potential noncompliance to regulatory bodies without a thorough internal assessment, might seem proactive but could be premature and damaging if the findings are inaccurate or can be resolved internally. This could lead to unnecessary scrutiny and potential sanctions for the client, and could also reflect poorly on Arcadis' judgment and internal processes. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a structured approach. First, understand the facts and assess the risk. Second, consult relevant internal policies and external regulations. Third, develop a proportionate response. And fourth, communicate effectively with all stakeholders. Question 4. Investigation of a proposed project for a key client at Arcadis reveals that certain aspects of the client's preferred methodology, while common in their industry, may not fully align with the latest environmental impact assessment guidelines mandated by the relevant UK regulatory bodies. Arcadis' project manager is under pressure to approve the client's approach to expedite the project timeline. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates Arcadis' commitment to professional integrity and regulatory compliance in this situation? Option A. Inform the client that their preferred methodology is unacceptable and withdraw from the project if they cannot immediately comply with all regulatory requirements, without exploring potential solutions. Option B. Proceed with the client's preferred methodology, assuming that industry common practice will likely be accepted by regulators, and address any potential issues only if they are raised by the regulatory authorities. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify specific areas of potential noncompliance with UK environmental impact assessment guidelines. Document these risks and propose alternative methodologies or mitigation strategies to the client that ensure full regulatory adherence, even if it impacts the initial timeline. Option D. Focus on meeting the client's timeline and budget as the primary objectives, and only conduct a cursory review of the environmental impact assessment guidelines to ensure no obvious breaches are present. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify specific areas of potential noncompliance with UK environmental impact assessment guidelines. Document these risks and propose alternative methodologies or mitigation strategies to the client that ensure full regulatory adherence, even if it impacts the initial timeline. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for Arcadis employees due to the inherent conflict between client expectations and regulatory compliance. Arcadis, as a consultancy, has a duty of care to its clients, but this duty is superseded by its obligation to adhere to the regulatory framework governing its operations. The challenge lies in navigating client requests that may push the boundaries of acceptable practice or potentially lead to non-compliance, requiring a robust risk assessment process to identify and mitigate these potential issues proactively. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented risk assessment that prioritizes regulatory adherence and ethical conduct. This approach is right because it ensures that Arcadis operates within the bounds of the law and its professional standards. Specifically, it involves identifying potential risks to compliance, evaluating their likelihood and impact, and developing mitigation strategies. This aligns with the overarching principles of professional responsibility and due diligence expected of Arcadis professionals, ensuring that client projects are delivered not only effectively, but also ethically and legally. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on client satisfaction without adequate consideration for regulatory implications would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the legal and ethical obligations that underpin Arcadis' license to operate and its reputation. Similarly, an approach that delays or omits a thorough risk assessment, hoping that issues will resolve themselves or be addressed later, is also flawed. This reactive stance increases the likelihood of significant compliance breaches, potentially leading to severe penalties for Arcadis and its employees, and damaging client relationships. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the project's objectives and constraints, including all applicable regulatory requirements. This is followed by a proactive risk identification and assessment phase, where potential compliance issues are flagged. Mitigation strategies are then developed and implemented, with ongoing monitoring to ensure effectiveness. If a conflict arises between client desires and regulatory requirements, the framework dictates that regulatory compliance and ethical considerations must take precedence, with clear communication to the client about the limitations and necessary adjustments. Question 5. Compliance review shows that a key client for Arcadis has requested an expedited delivery of a critical environmental impact assessment report, stating that their project timeline is at risk. The project manager is considering bypassing the final internal quality assurance and peer review stages to meet the client's deadline, believing the report is good enough for now and can be amended later. What is the most appropriate course of action for the project manager? Option A. Expedite the report delivery by skipping the final quality assurance and peer review stages to meet the client's deadline, with a note that the report is preliminary and subject to change. Option B. Provide the client with the report as is, without any disclaimers, to avoid jeopardizing the client relationship and the project timeline. Option C. Explain to the client the necessity of the internal review process for ensuring accuracy and compliance, and propose a revised timeline for the fully verified report, while exploring if any preliminary, clearly marked unverified data can be shared to assist their immediate needs without compromising the final report's integrity. Option D. Inform the client that Arcadis cannot meet their expedited timeline and suggest they seek services elsewhere if the deadline is non-negotiable. The correct answer is C. Explain to the client the necessity of the internal review process for ensuring accuracy and compliance, and propose a revised timeline for the fully verified report, while exploring if any preliminary, clearly marked unverified data can be shared to assist their immediate needs without compromising the final report's integrity. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's perceived urgency and Arcadis' ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to expedite a report, potentially compromising thoroughness, requires careful judgment to balance client satisfaction with professional integrity and legal adherence. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to Arcadis' internal quality control procedures and relevant regulatory guidelines over the client's immediate demand for a potentially incomplete report. This upholds professional standards by ensuring the accuracy and reliability of the delivered work. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of professional conduct that mandate diligence, competence, and the avoidance of misrepresentation, Regulatory frameworks often require that professional reports are based on sound methodologies and complete data, and rushing the process risks violating these requirements, potentially leading to professional liability and reputational damage for Arcadis. An incorrect approach would be to accede to the client's request to bypass standard review processes. This failure stems from a disregard for established quality assurance protocols, which are in place to prevent errors and ensure compliance. Ethically, it constitutes a breach of professional duty by potentially providing misleading information. Legally, it could violate regulations, requiring accurate reporting and due diligence. Another incorrect approach would be to provide a preliminary, unverified version of the report to the client, without clearly stating its incomplete and unverified nature. While seemingly a compromise, this still carries significant risk. It could be misinterpreted by the client as a final product, leading to decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate data. This misrepresentation, even if unintentional, can have serious consequences and violates the ethical duty of transparency and accuracy. A further incorrect approach would be to refuse the client's request outright without offering any alternative solutions or explanations. While maintaining integrity, this lacks client management skills and could damage the client relationship unnecessarily. A more professional response would involve explaining the necessity of the review process and offering to explore options for expediting the *verified* report, such as allocating additional resources or prioritizing specific sections for early, but still verified, delivery. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Understanding the client's underlying need and the reason for their urgency. 2. Clearly identifying the internal policies and external regulations that govern the reporting process. 3. Assessing the risks associated with deviating from these standards. 4. Communicating transparently with the client about the process, timelines, and any potential constraints. 5. Exploring all feasible options to meet the client's needs within the bounds of professional and regulatory requirements. 6. Documenting all communications and decisions made. Question 6. Compliance review shows that a senior consultant at Arcadis, working on a major infrastructure project, has been asked by a key client to present project cost projections in a manner that, while not explicitly falsifying data, would significantly downplay potential cost overruns to make the project appear more financially attractive. The client has emphasized that this presentation is crucial for securing further investment and has hinted at the importance of the consultant's continued good standing with them. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Arcadis consultant? Option A. Agree to present the projections as requested but privately document concerns and potential issues internally, hoping that the client's investment is secured and issues can be addressed later. Option B. Immediately escalate the situation to Arcadis' legal and compliance departments, providing all relevant documentation, and await their instructions before any further communication with the client regarding the projections. Option C. Politely decline the client's request to present the cost projections in a misleading manner. Clearly explain the ethical and professional obligations to provide accurate and unbiased information, and offer to present a balanced projection that includes potential risks and contingency planning. Option D. Present the cost projections as requested by the client, ensuring the data itself is not fabricated, but framing it in the most optimistic light possible to meet the client's immediate needs. The correct answer is D. Present the cost projections as requested by the client, ensuring the data itself is not fabricated, but framing it in the most optimistic light possible to meet the client's immediate needs. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific outcome and the Arcadis employee's professional and ethical obligations. The employee must navigate the pressure to satisfy the client, while upholding the integrity of Arcadis' services and adhering to relevant professional standards and regulations. Careful judgment is required to balance client relationships with ethical responsibilities. The correct approach involves clearly and professionally communicating the limitations and potential risks associated with the client's request, while offering alternative, compliant solutions. This upholds the professional duty of care, ensures transparency, and protects both the client and Arcadis from potential regulatory breaches or reputational damage. It aligns with ethical principles of honesty, integrity, and competence, and implicitly with any relevant professional codes of conduct that mandate providing accurate and unbiased advice. An incorrect approach of agreeing to the client's request without qualification would be a significant ethical and professional failure. It would demonstrate a lack of integrity and competence, potentially leading to regulatory noncompliance, financial penalties, and damage to Arcadis' reputation. This approach prioritizes short-term client satisfaction over long-term ethical conduct and professional responsibility. Another incorrect approach of dismissing the client's request outright without offering any constructive alternatives or explanation would be professionally damaging to the client relationship. While it avoids direct noncompliance, it fails to demonstrate a commitment to finding solutions within ethical and regulatory boundaries, potentially alienating the client and missing an opportunity to provide valuable, compliant advice. The professional reasoning process should involve 1. Fully understanding the client's objective and the underlying reasons for their request. 2. Assessing the request against all applicable regulations, professional standards, and Arcadis' internal policies. 3. Identifying any conflicts or potential risks. 4. Developing compliant alternatives or modifications that can achieve the client's underlying goals. 5. Communicating these findings and alternatives clearly and professionally to the client, explaining the rationale behind any limitations. Question 7. When evaluating a new business opportunity for Arcadis to submit a proposal for a significant infrastructure project, a senior project manager discovers during a preliminary site visit that the current client, who is managing the existing phase of the project, has expressed significant dissatisfaction with a particular design element implemented by a competitor in a previous, unrelated project. This dissatisfaction is not publicly known and was shared in a private conversation. The project manager believes this insight could be leveraged to tailor Arcadis' proposal to address this unspoken concern, potentially giving Arcadis a competitive edge. What is the most ethically and professionally sound approach for the project manager to take? Option A. Immediately inform the business development team about the client's private feedback, advising them to use this information to craft a proposal that directly highlights the competitor's perceived weakness and positions Arcadis as the superior alternative. Option B. Acknowledge the information internally but refrain from using it in the proposal, focusing instead on Arcadis' standard strengths and capabilities, and consider seeking guidance from Arcadis' ethics or legal department on how to handle such sensitive insights. Option C. Discreetly incorporate language into the proposal that subtly addresses the potential design flaw without explicitly referencing the client's private conversation, thereby demonstrating foresight and understanding of potential project challenges. Option D. Proceed with developing the proposal based on publicly available information and Arcadis' general expertise, considering the client's private feedback as informal and not a basis for a strategic advantage in the proposal. The correct answer is C. Discreetly incorporate language into the proposal that subtly addresses the potential design flaw without explicitly referencing the client's private conversation, thereby demonstrating foresight and understanding of potential project challenges. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing Arcadis' business interest with the ethical obligation to maintain client confidentiality and avoid conflicts of interest. The temptation to leverage non-public information for personal or team gain is significant, but acting on such information would breach fundamental professional duties. Careful judgment is required to navigate the gray area between general industry knowledge and specific, proprietary information that could unfairly advantage Arcadis. The correct approach involves recognizing the confidential nature of the information and refraining from using it in the proposal. This upholds the ethical principles of integrity and objectivity, as well as the regulatory requirement to protect client confidentiality. By not using the information, Arcadis avoids gaining an unfair competitive advantage derived from privileged knowledge, thereby demonstrating respect for the client and the competitive bidding process. This aligns with professional codes of conduct that emphasize honesty and fair dealing. An incorrect approach would be to subtly incorporate the confidential information into the proposal. This is ethically unsound as it constitutes a breach of confidentiality and potentially misrepresents Arcadis' capabilities by relying on information not available to competitors. It also creates a conflict of interest, as Arcadis would be benefiting from information obtained under a different professional obligation. Another incorrect approach would be to discuss the confidential information with colleagues outside the immediate project team who are involved in the proposal. This expands the breach of confidentiality and increases the risk of the information being inadvertently disclosed or misused. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the information as irrelevant and proceed with the proposal without any consideration of its potential impact. While not a direct breach of confidentiality, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and ethical awareness, potentially leading to a less competitive or even inappropriate proposal if the information was indeed critical to understanding the client's true needs. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This involves identifying potential conflicts of interest, assessing the nature of information, confidential vs. public, and consulting with supervisors or ethics officers when in doubt. The principle of when in doubt, err on the side of caution is paramount. Question 8. Strategic planning requires Arcadis to submit a competitive bid for a major infrastructure project. During the bid preparation, you discover that a key subcontractor you are considering has a significant business relationship with a close personal friend who is a senior executive at the client organization. This relationship is not publicly known. You believe this subcontractor is the best choice for the project, and your friend has indicated they would be supportive of your bid. What is the most ethically sound and professionally responsible course of action for you to take regarding this situation? Option A. Proceed with recommending the subcontractor, assuming the personal relationship will not influence your friend's professional judgment or the client's decision, and that the subcontractor's technical merit is the primary factor. Option B. Discreetly ensure the subcontractor's involvement is not explicitly highlighted in the bid documentation to avoid any potential scrutiny or complications arising from the personal connection. Option C. Inform your friend about the potential conflict and ask them to discreetly inquire with the client about the perceived strengths of Arcadis' bid, particularly concerning the proposed subcontractor, to gauge their receptiveness. Option D. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to your Arcadis project manager and the relevant Arcadis leadership, and recuse yourself from any further decision-making regarding the subcontractor selection and bid submission process. Correct answer is D. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to your Arcadis project manager and the relevant Arcadis leadership, and recuse yourself from any further decision-making regarding the subcontractor selection and bid submission process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing Arcadis' business objectives with ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to secure a significant contract, especially when facing competition, can tempt individuals to overlook or downplay potential conflicts of interest. Careful judgment is essential to ensure that Arcadis' reputation and integrity are maintained, and that all actions align with the relevant professional standards and Arcadis' internal policies. The correct approach involves proactively identifying and disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the relevant parties within Arcadis, and then recusing oneself from any decision-making processes related to the bid. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and transparency. Specifically, this aligns with principles of professional integrity and avoiding situations where personal interests could improperly influence professional judgment. While the Arcadis hiring assessment test does not specify a particular jurisdiction's regulations, professional engineering and consulting bodies globally, and by extension Arcadis' internal guidelines, mandate such disclosure and recusal to uphold client trust and prevent unfair advantage. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the bid without disclosing the relationship with the subcontractor. This failure to disclose a potential conflict of interest breaches the fundamental ethical duty of honesty and integrity, creates an environment where decisions might be perceived as biased, even if no actual impropriety occurred, thereby eroding trust with both the client and Arcadis' internal stakeholders. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to conceal the relationship by ensuring the subcontractor's involvement is not explicitly documented in the bid submission. This constitutes active deception and is a serious ethical and potentially legal violation. It undermines the principle of fair competition and can lead to severe reputational damage and contractual disputes if discovered. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to assume that the relationship is too minor to warrant disclosure. Professional ethics require disclosure of any situation that could reasonably be perceived as a conflict of interest, regardless of the perceived magnitude. Overlooking such potential conflicts due to personal judgment about their significance is a failure to adhere to the rigorous standards of professional conduct expected by clients and regulatory bodies. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear framework. 1. Identify potential conflicts of interest. 2. Assess the nature and severity of the conflict. 3. Consult relevant company policies and professional codes of conduct. 4. Disclose the conflict to appropriate internal stakeholders. 5. Recuse oneself from any decision-making processes where the conflict exists. 6. Document all actions taken. Question 9. Analysis of a situation where a client of Arcadis requests a specific project deliverable that, while technically feasible, appears to skirt the spirit of a newly implemented environmental regulation, potentially leading to a less robust environmental outcome than intended by the regulation. The client is pressuring for this approach, citing cost and time efficiencies. Option A. Politely but firmly explain to the client that Arcadis cannot proceed with the requested approach, as it may contravene the intent and spirit of the new environmental regulation, and propose alternative, compliant solutions that meet regulatory requirements while addressing the client's concerns about cost and time. Option B. Proceed with the client's requested approach, assuming that as long as the letter of the law is technically met, the spirit of the regulation is not a primary concern for Arcadis. Option C. Inform the client that Arcadis will implement their requested approach, but will add a disclaimer to the deliverable stating that the approach may not fully align with the spirit of the new environmental regulation. Option D. Advise the client that Arcadis will proceed as requested, and that the responsibility for interpreting the regulation spirit lies solely with the client. The correct answer is A. Politely but firmly explain to the client that Arcadis cannot proceed with the requested approach as it may contravene the intent and spirit of the new environmental regulation, and propose alternative, compliant solutions that meet regulatory requirements while addressing the client's concerns about cost and time. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desires and the ethical and regulatory obligations of a professional at Arcadis. The core dilemma lies in balancing client satisfaction with the duty to uphold professional integrity and regulatory compliance. A professional must exercise careful judgment to navigate this situation without compromising Arcadis' reputation or violating any applicable laws or ethical codes. The correct approach involves a transparent and principled stance, prioritizing regulatory adherence and professional ethics over short-term client appeasement. This approach is right because it directly addresses the client's request by explaining the limitations imposed by regulatory frameworks and professional standards. It upholds the duty of care and professional integrity by refusing to engage in practices that could be construed as misleading or non-compliant. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of professional conduct that mandate honesty, integrity, and adherence to all relevant laws and regulations. By clearly communicating these boundaries, the professional protects both the client from potential regulatory repercussions and Arcadis from reputational damage and legal liabilities. An incorrect approach that involves agreeing to the client's request without qualification is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for regulatory requirements and ethical principles. It could lead to Arcadis being complicit in non-compliant activities, resulting in severe penalties, loss of license, and irreparable damage to its standing in the industry. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the client's request and proceed without addressing their concerns, is also professionally flawed. This demonstrates a lack of client management and communication skills, potentially alienating the client and creating an adversarial relationship, while still not resolving the underlying ethical and regulatory issue. A third incorrect approach, which is to vaguely promise to look into it without committing to a compliant outcome, is misleading and unprofessional. It creates false expectations and avoids the necessary difficult conversation, ultimately failing to uphold professional responsibility. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the ethical and regulatory implications of a client's request. This involves consulting relevant codes of conduct, legal statutes, and internal Arcadis policies. If a request appears to conflict with these obligations, the next step is to clearly and respectfully communicate these limitations to the client, explaining the rationale behind them. The focus should always be on finding compliant solutions, or explaining why a particular course of action is not feasible due to regulatory or ethical constraints. Maintaining open communication and a commitment to integrity are paramount in such situations. Question 10. The audit findings indicate that a key client, with whom Arcadis has a significant ongoing relationship, is pressuring the audit team to significantly shorten the timeline for a critical project deliverable by suggesting the omission of several standard verification procedures. The project manager is concerned about jeopardizing the client relationship if they refuse, but also recognizes the importance of adhering to Arcadis' internal quality control policies and professional auditing standards. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Arcadis project manager in this situation? Option A. Agree to the client's request to expedite the timeline by omitting the specified verification procedures to maintain the client relationship, and address any potential compliance issues internally after the deliverable is submitted. Option B. Immediately escalate the situation to a senior partner at Arcadis without directly addressing the client's request, allowing the senior partner to handle the communication and decision-making. Option C. Politely but firmly explain to the client that the requested omissions are not permissible under professional auditing standards and Arcadis' quality policies, and propose alternative solutions for managing the timeline that do not compromise the audit's integrity. Option D. Agree to the expedited timeline but conduct a superficial review of all required verification procedures, aiming to complete the work quickly without deep substantive testing. The correct answer is C. Politely but firmly explain to the client that the requested omissions are not permissible under professional auditing standards and Arcadis' quality policies, and propose alternative solutions for managing the timeline that do not compromise the audit's integrity. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the conflict between a client's desire to expedite a project and the auditor's responsibility to adhere to established auditing standards and maintain professional skepticism. Arcadis, as a professional services firm, is bound by ethical codes and regulatory requirements that prioritize the integrity and accuracy of its work over client pressure. The core of the challenge lies in balancing client relationships with the non-negotiable principles of professional conduct. The correct approach involves a firm but professional refusal to compromise on the audit process. This means clearly communicating to the client that the requested shortcuts are not permissible under the relevant auditing standards, and that a thorough review is necessary to ensure the reliability of the findings. This approach upholds Arcadis' professional integrity, maintains client trust by demonstrating a commitment to quality, and ensures compliance with regulatory frameworks governing audit procedures, prioritizes the long-term reputation and ethical standing of the firm over short-term client satisfaction. An incorrect approach of agreeing to the client's request to expedite by omitting key audit steps would constitute a serious breach of professional ethics and regulatory compliance. This would violate the fundamental principles of due professional care and professional skepticism, which require auditors to conduct their work with diligence and a questioning mind, not to accept assertions at face value without sufficient evidence. Such an action could lead to inaccurate audit reports, potentially misleading stakeholders, and expose Arcadis to significant reputational damage and legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach of deferring the decision to a more senior manager without immediate communication of the ethical dilemma to the client is also problematic. While escalation is important, delaying the direct response to the client about the impossibility of their request can create false expectations and prolong the ethical conflict. It fails to address the immediate issue with the necessary transparency and decisiveness. Finally, an incorrect approach of agreeing to the expedited timeline but performing a superficial review that still attempts to cover all areas would also be a failure. This is essentially a form of misrepresentation, as the work would not be conducted with the required level of diligence and thoroughness, even if all steps were nominally ticked off. It undermines the very purpose of an audit, which is to provide reasonable assurance, not just a perfunctory exercise. The professional reasoning process in such a situation should involve 1. Identifying the ethical conflict and the relevant professional standards. 2. Clearly articulating the constraints imposed by these standards to the client. 3. Proposing alternative solutions that respect both the client's needs and the auditor's professional obligations, such as reallocating resources or adjusting the scope within permissible boundaries. 4. Documenting all communications and decisions. 5. escalating the issue if necessary, but always with a clear understanding of the ethical and regulatory imperatives. Question 11. The assessment process reveals that a promising candidate for a senior role at Arcadis has recently been involved in a significant financial transaction that could be perceived as a conflict of interest with the responsibilities of the position they are being considered for. How should the Arcadis hiring team proceed? Option A. Inform the candidate about the discovered financial transaction and ask them to provide a detailed explanation of how it might impact their role at Arcadis, but make a hiring decision solely based on their response without further internal review. Option B. Initiate a formal review process involving Arcadis' HR and legal/compliance departments to assess the nature and severity of the potential conflict of interest, gather further information if necessary, and determine the appropriate course of action in line with Arcadis' ethical guidelines and professional standards. Option C. Immediately halt the candidate's application and inform them that their application has been unsuccessful due to a potential conflict of interest, without further investigation. Option D. Proceed with the hiring process as planned, assuming the candidate will manage any potential conflicts ethically once in the role, and do not disclose the discovered information to the candidate or internal stakeholders. Correct answer is C. Immediately halt the candidate's application and inform them that their application has been unsuccessful due to a potential conflict of interest, without further investigation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge rooted in the potential conflict between an individual's personal financial interests and their duty of care and professional integrity within Arcadis. The assessment process, designed to evaluate candidates, has uncovered information that could compromise an individual's objectivity and potentially lead to a breach of ethical standards and regulatory compliance. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that any decision made regarding the candidate's progression is fair, transparent, and upholds Arcadis' commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence. The correct approach involves a transparent and objective review process that prioritizes Arcadis' ethical guidelines and relevant professional standards. This means acknowledging the discovered information without immediate judgment and initiating a formal, documented process to assess its implications. This approach is right because it adheres to principles of due process, fairness, and integrity. It allows for a thorough investigation into whether the discovered information constitutes a conflict of interest or a breach of Arcadis' code of conduct, which are fundamental to maintaining professional standards and client trust. By involving appropriate internal stakeholders, such as HR and legal/compliance departments, Arcadis ensures that decisions are made in accordance with its internal policies and any applicable regulatory frameworks governing professional conduct and hiring. This systematic approach mitigates the risk of biased decision-making and ensures that any action taken is justifiable and defensible. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the candidate outright based solely on the discovered information without a proper investigation. This fails to provide the candidate with due process and could lead to an unfair outcome. It also bypasses Arcadis' internal procedures for handling such situations, potentially exposing the company to reputational damage or legal challenges. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the discovered information and proceed with the hiring process as if nothing had happened. This is ethically unsound and a direct violation of Arcadis' commitment to integrity. It creates a significant risk of future conflicts of interest, reputational damage, and potential regulatory noncompliance if the candidate's undisclosed interests were to impact their professional duties. Furthermore, it undermines the integrity of the assessment process itself. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Acknowledge and document the discovered information. 2. Consult Arcadis' internal policies and code of conduct regarding conflicts of interest, ethical behavior, and hiring practices. 3. Engage relevant internal departments, e.g., HR, legal/compliance, to ensure a comprehensive and objective review. 4. Gather all necessary facts and allow for the candidate to provide context or explanation if appropriate and within policy. 5. Make a decision based on a thorough assessment of the facts against established ethical and regulatory standards. 6. Document the decision-making process and the rationale behind the final outcome. Question 12. Research into a recent project for a key client of Arcadis has uncovered information suggesting that the client may be engaging in aggressive tax avoidance schemes that could potentially cross the line into illegal tax evasion. The information was discovered incidentally during a review of project documentation. Option A. Immediately cease all work for the client and report the suspected evasion to the relevant tax authorities without further investigation. Option B. Ignore the information as it was discovered incidentally and not directly related to the core scope of the Arcadis project. Option C. Conduct a thorough internal review of the discovered information, consult with Arcadis' internal compliance and legal teams, and seek clarification from the client if appropriate before determining further action. Option D. Directly confront the client's finance director with the suspicions and demand an explanation before involving any internal Arcadis departments. The correct answer is A. Immediately cease all work for the client and report the suspected evasion to the relevant tax authorities without further investigation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing client confidentiality with the potential for significant financial impropriety. Arcadis, as a professional services firm, has a duty of care to its clients and must uphold the highest ethical standards. The dilemma lies in discerning when a client's actions cross the line from aggressive tax planning to illegal evasion, and what Arcadis' obligations are in such a situation. Careful judgment is required to avoid both complicity in illegal activities and the wrongful accusation of a client. The correct approach involves a structured internal review and escalation process. This begins with a thorough assessment of the information received, seeking clarification from the client where appropriate, and documenting all findings. If the review suggests potential noncompliance or illegal activity, the professional obligation is to report this internally to designated compliance or legal departments. This ensures that Arcadis can take appropriate action, which may include ceasing the engagement, reporting to relevant authorities if legally mandated, or seeking independent legal advice. This aligns with professional codes of conduct that mandate integrity, professional behavior, and adherence to laws and regulations. Specifically in the UK, this would involve considering the proceeds of Crime Act 2002, POCA, and the Money Laundering Regulations 2017, which impose reporting obligations for suspicious activity. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the information or dismiss it without proper investigation. This demonstrates a failure of due diligence and professional skepticism, potentially making Arcadis complicit in illegal activities. Another incorrect approach is to directly report the client to authorities without internal consultation. This could breach client confidentiality unnecessarily, damage the firm's reputation, and may be premature if the information is misinterpreted or if there are legitimate explanations. Furthermore, acting solely on personal judgment without following established internal procedures for handling such sensitive matters is a significant ethical and professional failing. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the firm's internal policies and procedures for handling suspected financial misconduct. Professionals should always exercise professional skepticism, gather all relevant facts, document their findings meticulously, and escalate concerns through the appropriate internal channels. Seeking advice from senior colleagues, compliance officers, or legal counsel is crucial when faced with complex ethical or legal ambiguities. The overarching principle is to act with integrity, uphold professional standards, and comply with all applicable laws and regulations. Question 13. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a minor, unpermitted discharge from a construction site managed by Arcadis, while technically a breach of environmental regulations, is unlikely to cause immediate or significant environmental damage, and addressing it would incur substantial project delays and costs. What is the most ethically and legally sound course of action for the Arcadis project manager? Option A. Conceal the infraction, as the cost of remediation and delays outweighs the minimal perceived environmental risk, and focus on completing the project on time and within budget. Option B. Document the infraction internally but take no external action, assuming that minor breaches are often overlooked by regulators and the focus should remain on project delivery. Option C. Inform the client of the infraction and propose a private remediation plan that avoids involving regulatory bodies to minimize project disruption. Option D. Immediately report the infraction to the relevant environmental regulatory authority and inform the client of the breach and the necessary steps to rectify it. The correct answer is D. Immediately report the infraction to the relevant environmental regulatory authority and inform the client of the breach and the necessary steps to rectify it. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it pits potential financial gain against ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. Arcadis, as a professional services firm, has a duty to act with integrity and uphold public trust. The temptation to overlook a minor environmental infraction for the sake of a profitable project, especially when the immediate consequences seem negligible, requires careful ethical navigation. The core of the challenge lies in balancing commercial interests with the responsibility to adhere to environmental regulations and maintain professional standards. The correct approach involves prioritizing regulatory compliance and ethical conduct over short-term financial benefits. This means immediately reporting the observed environmental infraction to the relevant authorities and the client, even if it jeopardizes the project's profitability or timeline. This approach is justified by the fundamental principles of professional responsibility, which mandate adherence to all applicable laws and regulations. Specifically, environmental regulations are designed to protect public health and the environment, and any deviation, however minor it may seem, can have cumulative negative impacts. Furthermore, professional codes of conduct for engineers and environmental consultants typically emphasize honesty, integrity, and a commitment to public safety and welfare. Concealing or downplaying such an infraction would violate these core ethical tenets and could expose Arcadis to significant legal and reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to ignore or downplay the environmental infraction, rationalizing that it is minor and unlikely to cause significant harm. This failure stems from a misapplication of cost-benefit analysis, focusing solely on immediate financial gains while disregarding the long-term risks and ethical implications. Such an approach violates environmental laws, which impose strict liability for noncompliance, regardless of intent or perceived minor impact. It also breaches professional ethics by demonstrating a lack of integrity and a willingness to compromise standards for commercial advantage. Another incorrect approach would be to report the infraction to the client only, without informing the regulatory authorities. This is also a failure because it attempts to manage the situation internally without fulfilling the legal obligation to report to the relevant government bodies. This can be seen as an attempt to circumvent regulatory oversight and can still lead to penalties if discovered. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear hierarchy of priorities. First, adherence to legal and regulatory requirements. Second, upholding ethical principles and professional standards. And third, considering commercial interests. When a conflict arises, the former must always take precedence. Professionals should be trained to identify potential ethical dilemmas and have clear internal protocols for reporting and addressing such issues, involving senior management and legal counsel when necessary. A robust ethical framework encourages open communication and provides a safe channel for reporting concerns without fear of reprisal. Question 14. Comparative studies suggest that consultants often face pressure to meet client demands, even when those demands may skirt regulatory boundaries. Imagine an Arcadis project manager is advising a client on a new development project. The client requests a specific design element that, while not explicitly illegal, appears to contravene the spirit of a recently introduced environmental regulation aimed at preserving local biodiversity. The project manager suspects this request could lead to regulatory scrutiny and potential penalties for the client, and by extension, Arcadis. What is the most ethically and professionally responsible course of action for the Arcadis project manager? Option A. Inform the client that the design element is problematic, but suggest a minor modification that might technically satisfy the letter of the law while still achieving the client's original intent, even if it doesn't fully address the environmental concerns. Option B. Advise the client that the requested design element is not feasible due to potential regulatory noncompliance and explore alternative design solutions that fully adhere to the environmental regulation. Option C. Proceed with the client's requested design element, assuming that if it's not explicitly forbidden, it is acceptable, and address any potential regulatory issues if they arise later. Option D. Immediately withdraw from the project to avoid any association with potential regulatory noncompliance, without further discussion with the client. The correct answer is B. Advise the client that the requested design element is not feasible due to potential regulatory noncompliance, and explore alternative design solutions that fully adhere to the environmental regulation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desires and the consultant's ethical and regulatory obligations. Arcadis, as a professional services firm, is bound by strict codes of conduct and regulatory frameworks that prioritize integrity, transparency, and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. The challenge lies in navigating the pressure to satisfy a client while upholding these fundamental principles. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any advice or action taken by Arcadis personnel is not only commercially beneficial to the client, but also compliant with all applicable laws and ethical standards, thereby protecting both the client's and Arcadis' reputation. The correct approach involves a direct and transparent communication with the client regarding the limitations and potential conflicts. This means clearly articulating that Arcadis cannot proceed with the requested action if it violates any regulatory requirements or ethical guidelines. The justification for this approach stems from the core principles of professional responsibility, which mandate adherence to legal and ethical standards above client expediency, specifically in the context of a regulated industry, which is implied by the need for regulatory compliance. Any action that circumvents or breaches these regulations would expose both the client and Arcadis to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and loss of trust. Upholding these standards ensures long-term sustainability and client confidence. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request without full disclosure or to attempt to find a loophole that, while technically not a direct violation, skirts the spirit of the regulation. This is professionally unacceptable because it demonstrates a disregard for the regulatory framework and ethical principles. Such actions can lead to severe consequences, including regulatory sanctions, fines, and potential disqualification from future projects. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without offering alternative compliance solutions. While maintaining integrity is paramount, professional consultants should also strive to assist the client within the bounds of ethical and legal practice, offering guidance on how to achieve their objectives in a compliant manner. Failing to do so can be seen as a lack of client service, though it is less severe than actively engaging in non-compliant behavior. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the relevant regulatory framework and ethical codes. When faced with a client request that appears to push boundaries, the professional should 1. Identify the potential ethical or regulatory concern. 2. Consult internal policies and relevant regulations. 3. Seek guidance from senior colleagues or legal counsel if uncertainty exists. 4. Communicate transparently with the client, explaining the concerns and the rationale behind any limitations. 5. Propose compliant alternatives that still aim to meet the client's underlying objectives. This structured approach ensures that decisions are well-reasoned, defensible, and aligned with professional standards. Question 15. The control framework reveals that a long-standing client of Arcadis has requested a specific project deliverable that, while technically feasible, appears to circumvent a recently introduced regulatory requirement designed to enhance environmental protection. The client suggests a minor modification to the deliverable that would technically meet their request and generate significant immediate revenue for Arcadis, but it would likely undermine the spirit and intent of the new regulation. What is the most ethically sound and professionally responsible course of action for Arcadis? Option A. Agree to the modification, but inform the client that Arcadis will not be liable for any future regulatory penalties arising from this approach. Option B. Implement the modification as requested by the client and discreetly omit any mention of the new regulation in the project documentation. Option C. Politely decline the client's requested modification, clearly explaining that it appears to contravene the spirit of the new environmental regulation, and propose alternative, compliant solutions that still address the client's underlying project objectives. Option D. Proceed with the client's requested modification, as it technically meets the stated requirements and offers significant financial benefit. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the client's requested modification, as it technically meets the stated requirements and offers significant financial benefit. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing Arcadis' ethical obligations with the potential for financial gain, all while operating within a specific regulatory environment. The core dilemma lies in the potential conflict between a client's immediate request and the long-term implications for Arcadis' reputation and adherence to professional standards. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation without compromising integrity or violating regulatory requirements. The correct approach involves prioritizing Arcadis' ethical duty and regulatory compliance over the immediate financial benefit. This means clearly communicating to the client that the requested action, while seemingly beneficial in the short term, would contravene established ethical guidelines and potentially lead to regulatory scrutiny. Arcadis should then offer alternative, compliant solutions that still address the client's underlying needs. This aligns with the principles of professional conduct, which mandate honesty, integrity, and a commitment to avoiding conflicts of interest and upholding regulatory standards. Specifically, this approach would adhere to any relevant professional body codes of conduct and Arcadis' internal policies on ethical business practices and client engagement. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request without question. This would represent a failure to uphold professional integrity and could expose Arcadis to significant reputational damage and regulatory penalties. It demonstrates a disregard for ethical principles and a prioritization of short-term financial gain over long-term sustainability and compliance. Another incorrect approach would be to agree to the request but attempt to conceal the non-compliant aspect. This constitutes dishonesty and a deliberate attempt to circumvent regulatory oversight, which is a severe ethical and legal breach. Such an action would undermine trust with both the client and regulatory bodies. A third incorrect approach would be to refuse the request outright without offering any alternative solutions or explanations. While this avoids direct non-compliance, it fails to demonstrate a commitment to client service and problem-solving, potentially damaging the client relationship unnecessarily. A more professional response would involve explaining the limitations and offering compliant alternatives. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured ethical assessment. This includes identifying the ethical issue, understanding the relevant regulatory framework and internal policies, considering the potential consequences of different actions, consulting with colleagues or supervisors if necessary, and ultimately choosing the course of action that best upholds ethical principles and regulatory compliance while striving to meet client needs within those boundaries. Question 16. Regulatory review indicates that a key client of Arcadis has requested a specific project deliverable that, upon initial assessment by a project manager, appears to deviate from standard Arcadis procedures and potentially from certain environmental compliance guidelines. The client is insistent on this specific approach, citing past experiences with other consultants. The project manager is concerned about both client satisfaction and upholding Arcadis' commitment to regulatory adherence and professional standards. Option A. Clearly communicate to the client that the requested approach cannot be accommodated due to potential regulatory noncompliance and internal policy deviations, and propose alternative, compliant solutions that meet the client's underlying objectives. Option B. Agree to the client's requested approach to maintain client satisfaction, with the intention of addressing any compliance issues retrospectively if they arise. Option C. Proceed with the client's requested approach without further internal consultation, assuming the client's experience overrides Arcadis' standard protocols. Option D. Inform the client that Arcadis cannot fulfill their request and cease further discussion on the matter. The correct answer is A. Clearly communicate to the client that the requested approach cannot be accommodated due to potential regulatory noncompliance and internal policy deviations, and propose alternative, compliant solutions that meet the client's underlying objectives. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desires and the Arcadis employee's professional and regulatory obligations. The employee must navigate the potential for reputational damage to Arcadis, breaches of professional conduct, and potential regulatory sanctions if client expectations are met without proper due diligence and adherence to established procedures. Careful judgment is required to balance client relationships with ethical responsibilities and legal compliance. The correct approach involves prioritizing transparency, adherence to Arcadis' internal policies, and compliance with relevant professional standards and regulations. This means clearly communicating the limitations of the proposed solution, explaining the rationale behind Arcadis' established processes, and offering alternative, compliant solutions. This upholds the professional integrity of the employee in Arcadis, mitigates legal and regulatory risks, and fosters a relationship built on trust and competence, rather than on potentially misleading assurances. An incorrect approach that involves agreeing to the client's request without further investigation or consultation would fail to uphold professional duty of care and could lead to a misrepresentation of Arcadis' capabilities or the feasibility of the project. This could result in regulatory scrutiny, disciplinary action, and damage to Arcadis' reputation. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the client's request outright without offering any explanation or alternative, would be unprofessional and could damage the client relationship unnecessarily. While maintaining compliance is paramount, a complete lack of engagement or attempted problem-solving is not in line with best client service practices. A further incorrect approach, such as agreeing to the request but intending to address the compliance issues later, constitutes a serious ethical lapse and a breach of regulatory requirements. This kick-the-can-down-the-road mentality creates significant risk for Arcadis and demonstrates a lack of commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's underlying need. Then, they must assess the request against Arcadis' internal policies, professional codes of conduct, and applicable regulations. If a conflict arises, the next step is to communicate the constraints clearly and professionally to the client, explaining the reasons for any limitations and proposing compliant alternatives. Escalation to a supervisor or relevant internal department should occur if the situation is complex or if there is uncertainty about the correct course of action. Question 17. Consider a scenario where a junior engineer at Arcadis, while reviewing project documentation for a significant infrastructure development, discovers a minor discrepancy in the recorded material specifications for a non-critical component. This discrepancy appears to be a clerical error during data entry and does not seem to impact the structural integrity or safety of the component. The junior engineer is concerned about the accuracy of the project records, but is also aware of tight project deadlines and the potential for delays if the issue is escalated unnecessarily. What is the most appropriate course of action for the junior engineer to take? Option A. Overlook the discrepancy, assuming it is a minor clerical error that will not affect the project's outcome or compliance. Option B. Immediately report the discrepancy to the project manager and the Arcadis Compliance Department for internal review and guidance. Option C. Directly contact the client to inform them of the discrepancy and seek their input on how to proceed. Option D. Attempt to correct the discrepancy in the project records independently without consulting any internal Arcadis personnel or management. The correct answer is B. Immediately report the discrepancy to the project manager and the Arcadis Compliance Department for internal review and guidance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing Arcadis' commitment to ethical conduct and compliance with potential pressure to overlook a minor infraction for the sake of expediency or client relationship. The core of the dilemma lies in distinguishing between a genuine ethical lapse and a procedural oversight that, while not ideal, does not fundamentally compromise the integrity of the project or Arcadis' professional obligations. Careful judgment is required to assess the materiality of the infraction and its potential downstream consequences. The correct approach involves promptly and transparently reporting the identified discrepancy to the appropriate internal channels within Arcadis, such as the project manager or compliance department. This aligns with Arcadis' stated commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence. By initiating an internal review, Arcadis can ensure that any potential risks are identified and mitigated, and that the project remains compliant with all relevant regulations and contractual obligations. This proactive stance upholds professional integrity and demonstrates a commitment to quality and accountability, which are paramount in the consulting engineering industry. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the discrepancy, assuming it is minor and unlikely to cause significant issues. This failure to report and address the issue constitutes a breach of professional duty and potentially Arcadis' internal policies and ethical codes. It creates a risk of undetected noncompliance, which could lead to more serious consequences later, including contractual breaches, reputational damage, and regulatory penalties. Another incorrect approach would be to directly inform the client of the discrepancy without first consulting internal Arcadis protocols or management. While transparency with clients is important, bypassing internal reporting structures can undermine Arcadis' own quality control processes and may lead to miscommunication or premature disclosure of information that requires internal assessment and strategic communication. This could also create an impression of Arcadis not having robust internal oversight. A third incorrect approach would be to attempt to rectify the discrepancy unilaterally without proper documentation or authorization. This could lead to further errors, create an inaccurate project record, and potentially violate contractual terms or regulatory requirements regarding change management and record keeping. It bypasses the necessary checks and balances designed to ensure accuracy and compliance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of Arcadis' internal policies, ethical guidelines, and relevant regulatory frameworks. When faced with a potential issue, the first step should always be to assess its nature and potential impact. If there is any doubt, or if the issue appears to have implications for compliance, quality, or contractual obligations, the established internal reporting channels should be utilized without delay. This ensures that the matter is handled by the appropriate personnel with the necessary expertise and authority, and that Arcadis maintains a consistent and ethical approach to its projects. Question 18. Benchmark analysis indicates that a key client of Arcadis has requested a specific project deliverable that, while technically feasible, appears to contravene the spirit of a recently updated environmental regulation. The client is insistent, believing their interpretation of the regulation is correct and that Arcadis should proceed accordingly to meet their aggressive timeline. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Arcadis project manager? Option A. Inform the client that Arcadis cannot proceed with the deliverable as requested due to potential regulatory noncompliance, and propose an alternative approach that fully adheres to the regulation, even if it impacts the timeline. Option B. Advise the client to seek independent legal counsel to confirm their interpretation of the regulation, and then proceed based on that advice without further internal review by Arcadis. Option C. Proceed with the deliverable as requested by the client, assuming their interpretation of the regulation is valid and prioritizing client satisfaction and timeline adherence. Option D. Proceed with the deliverable, but include a disclaimer in the final report acknowledging the potential regulatory ambiguity, hoping this mitigates Arcadis' liability. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the deliverable as requested by the client, assuming their interpretation of the regulation is valid and prioritizing client satisfaction and timeline adherence. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's request and the professional's ethical obligations and regulatory requirements. Arcadis, as a professional services firm, is bound by strict codes of conduct and relevant regulations to maintain integrity and uphold public trust. The challenge lies in navigating the pressure to satisfy a client while ensuring compliance and ethical standards are not compromised. Careful judgment is required to identify the appropriate course of action that balances client relationships with professional responsibilities. The correct approach involves clearly communicating the limitations and regulatory constraints to the client, explaining why their request cannot be fulfilled as stated. This demonstrates transparency and professionalism. Specifically, adhering to the Arcadis Code of Conduct and any applicable professional body guidelines, e.g., those governing engineering or environmental consulting in the relevant jurisdiction, would mandate that Arcadis does not engage in misleading or unethical practices. This approach prioritizes integrity, compliance, and the long-term reputation of the firm over short-term client appeasement. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request without full disclosure or by attempting to circumvent regulations. This could lead to regulatory breaches, professional sanctions, damage to Arcadis' reputation, and potential legal liabilities. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns outright without a thorough explanation, which could damage the client relationship unnecessarily and fail to educate the client on professional standards. A third incorrect approach might involve seeking a loophole in the regulations that, while technically permissible, could still be perceived as unethical or against the spirit of the law, thereby undermining professional integrity. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's underlying need. Then, they must identify all relevant ethical codes, company policies, and regulatory requirements. If a conflict arises, the professional should seek to find a compliant and ethical solution that addresses the client's need. If no such solution exists, clear and professional communication of the limitations, along with alternative, compliant suggestions, is paramount. Escalation to senior management or legal counsel may be necessary if the situation is complex or carries significant risk. Question 19. The investigation demonstrates that a key infrastructure project managed by Arcadis is facing significant unforeseen environmental challenges that will substantially increase costs and delay completion. The client, a major developer, has expressed a strong desire for the final report to reflect a more optimistic outlook, suggesting that certain findings be downplayed to avoid jeopardizing their financing arrangements. How should the Arcadis project manager proceed? Option A. Present the findings of the investigation accurately and objectively in the report, clearly outlining the environmental challenges, their potential impact on costs and timelines, and any recommended mitigation strategies, while also communicating the client's concerns and the rationale for the report's content to the client. Option B. Omit detailed information about the environmental challenges from the report and focus solely on the project's positive aspects to maintain client satisfaction. Option C. Modify the report to downplay the severity of the environmental challenges and present a more optimistic cost and timeline projection, as requested by the client, to help secure their financing. Option D. Refuse to submit the report until the client agrees to a less critical assessment of the environmental challenges, potentially leading to a stalemate. The correct answer is A. Present the findings of the investigation accurately and objectively in the report, clearly outlining the environmental challenges, their potential impact on costs and timelines, and any recommended mitigation strategies, while also communicating the client's concerns and the rationale for the report's content to the client. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desires and the consultant's ethical and regulatory obligations. Arcadis, as a professional services firm, is bound by strict codes of conduct and regulatory frameworks that prioritize integrity, accuracy, and compliance. The challenge lies in navigating the pressure to deliver a report that satisfies the client's preferred outcome while upholding these fundamental principles. A consultant must exercise sound professional judgment, recognizing that their duty extends beyond client satisfaction to include adherence to professional standards and legal requirements. The correct approach involves a commitment to factual accuracy and transparency, even when it may be unwelcome news for the client. This means presenting the findings of the investigation objectively, supported by evidence, and clearly articulating any limitations or potential risks identified. This approach aligns with the core ethical principles of professional integrity and competence, as well as regulatory requirements that mandate honest and accurate reporting. By adhering to the facts and professional standards, Arcadis fulfills its duty to provide reliable advice and maintain its reputation for trustworthiness. An incorrect approach would be to alter the report's findings to align with the client's desired outcome. This constitutes a serious ethical breach, as it involves misrepresentation and a failure to act with integrity. Such an action could lead to significant reputational damage for Arcadis, potential legal repercussions, and a violation of professional body guidelines that emphasize honesty and objectivity. Another incorrect approach would be to withhold crucial information or downplay negative findings to appease the client. This also undermines the principle of transparency and can lead to the client making decisions based on incomplete or misleading information, which is both unethical and potentially harmful. A third incorrect approach might be to simply refuse to provide the report without a clear and justifiable explanation, which could be seen as a failure to meet professional obligations and could damage the client relationship unnecessarily. Professionals should approach such situations by first ensuring a thorough understanding of the investigation's findings and the relevant regulatory and ethical guidelines. They should then communicate these findings clearly and objectively to the client, explaining the basis for their conclusions. If the client expresses dissatisfaction, The professional should be prepared to discuss the findings further, provide supporting evidence, and explore alternative solutions that remain within ethical and regulatory boundaries. The decision-making process should prioritize adherence to professional standards and legal obligations above immediate client appeasement. Question 20. The analysis reveals that a key client, with whom Arcadis is in the final stages of contract negotiation for a significant project, has offered a senior Arcadis employee a substantial personal gift and an all-expenses-paid trip to a luxury resort during the negotiation period. The employee is concerned that accepting this offer could be perceived as compromising Arcadis' integrity or violating ethical guidelines. Option A. Politely decline the offer but continue with the contract negotiations without informing Arcadis management, assuming the offer was made in good faith and is not a significant issue. Option B. Accept the gift and trip, considering it a gesture of goodwill that will strengthen the client relationship and potentially expedite contract finalization. Option C. Immediately report the offer to Arcadis' internal compliance department and await their guidance before taking any further action. Option D. Accept the gift and trip, but disclose it to Arcadis management after the contract is signed, framing it as a successful client engagement. The correct answer is C. Immediately report the offer to Arcadis' internal compliance department and await their guidance before taking any further action. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing Arcadis' commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance with the potential for financial gain and the desire to maintain a positive client relationship. The core dilemma lies in navigating the gray area of what constitutes an improper advantage and ensuring that all actions align with the Arcadis Code of Conduct and relevant anti-bribery legislation. Careful judgment is required to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent communication strategy. This means immediately reporting the offer to the appropriate internal Arcadis compliance or legal department. This approach is correct because it adheres to Arcadis' internal policies, which mandate reporting of potential ethical breaches and conflicts of interest. Furthermore, it aligns with the principles of anti-bribery and corruption laws, which often require individuals to report such offers to prevent further escalation and potential violations. By seeking guidance from internal experts, Arcadis ensures that any subsequent actions are compliant and ethically sound, protecting both the company and the individual employee. An incorrect approach would be to accept the offer, believing it to be a harmless gesture or a standard business practice. This is ethically and regulatorily flawed because it directly violates anti-bribery principles by seeking to gain an advantage through a gift or hospitality that exceeds reasonable limits. It also creates a significant conflict of interest and could be construed as bribery or corruption under relevant legislation, leading to severe legal and reputational consequences for both the employee and Arcadis. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the offer and proceed with the project without reporting it, assuming that since no explicit quid pro quo was stated, no harm is done. This is also professionally unacceptable. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence in upholding Arcadis' values and a failure to identify and mitigate potential risks. Regulatorily, many anti-bribery laws have a broad scope and can encompass actions that create the appearance of impropriety or that could be seen as influencing decision-making, even if not explicitly stated. Failure to report could be seen as complicity or negligence. A professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Recognizing the potential ethical or regulatory issue. 2. Consulting Arcadis' Code of Conduct and relevant policies. 3. Seeking guidance from the designated internal compliance or legal department. 4. Acting only after receiving clear direction and ensuring all actions are documented. This structured approach ensures that decisions are made with full awareness of ethical obligations and legal requirements, minimizing risk and upholding professional integrity.